A toddler wriggled free at the fair, ran to the widow and wailed, "Mama, up!" The boy got loose about 10 steps past the livestock pens. I had his hand and then I didn't. That's how fast it goes with a 2-year-old. 1 second his fat little fingers were wrapped around 2 of mine, and then he twisted the way only a child that age can, boneless, sudden, and he was gone into the crowd before I could get a word out. I said his name, Caleb, not loud enough to start a panic but loud enough to part a few heads. August heat sat on the fairground flat and close, the kind that smells like trampled grass and animal and fried dough all at once, and there were boots everywhere, boots and skirts and trouser legs, and I was scanning all of it for a pair of small brown shoes. I wasn't scared yet. That came about 4 seconds later. Then I heard him, not crying. He wasn't a crier, never had been, not since the day he was born, and came out looking around the room like he was pricing it. What I heard was his voice going up at the end, that particular pitch that meant he'd found something that interested him completely, and I followed the sound around 2 women in bonnets, and a man selling tin cups from a wagon, and there was Caleb, standing in front of a woman who was crouched down to his level with a half-eaten piece of corn bread in one hand and her skirts pooled on the ground around her. He looked at her, she looked at him, and then my son put both his arms straight up and said, plain as a verdict, "Mama, up." I don't know what I expected her to do. Laugh, maybe, or look around for whoever this child belonged to. Instead, she set the corn bread down on the edge of the wagon bench behind her, put both hands under his arms and picked him up, just like that. Settled him on her hip the same way a woman who's carried a child 1,000 times does, where the boy sits balanced and easy with one arm looped around her neck, and she looked at him with something close to steady calm, like this happened to her all the time, or like it didn't surprise her even if it didn't. I got there about 3 seconds after that. I said, "That's mine," meaning Caleb. She said, "I figured." She didn't hand him back right away. She waited for me to get close and take stock of her face first, I think, or maybe that's how I remember it. Brown eyes, a little tired around the edges in the way that's not age so much as work. Jaw set square. She wasn't young, but she wasn't old, somewhere in the middle of a life, wearing a dress that was clean but had been mended at the collar. No ring on her hand. I noticed that and then felt like a fool for noticing it, with my son sitting on her hip looking at me like I'd come to spoil his afternoon. I took him. He went without argument, which was more than he usually gave me. I said, "I'm sorry about that, he gets loose." She said, "They do." I said thank you, and I meant it to end there, but Caleb grabbed a fistful of my collar and then turned around and pointed back at her and said a word that was supposed to be something. I still couldn't tell you what, and she smiled at that. A real one, not the polite kind. I asked her name. I don't know why. It wasn't a question I'd asked a woman in 2 years. She told me, Clara Denning. She'd come from a homestead about 8 miles east, she said, alone, just to get a look at the fair and buy salt and 2 pounds of flour she couldn't get at the trading post for a decent price. I told her my name, Thomas Holt. I told her the boy was Caleb and he was 2 years and 3 months old and he had no mother, which was an odd thing to say to a stranger, but it came out before I'd sorted it. She said, "I know what it is to do that alone." I believed her. There was nothing sorry in how she said it. She just meant she knew. Caleb fell asleep on my shoulder about 40 minutes later, over near the horses, in the shade of a cottonwood that had grown up through a gap in the fence. I was standing there with him because he'd been running since before dawn, and his weight was finally going slack, and I didn't want to be in the sun when he dropped off. Clara Denning came past, and I don't know if she was looking for me or if it was just the fair being small, but she slowed when she saw us and looked at the boy's face against my neck, eyes closed, and she said, "He's got your jaw." I told her that was probably not good for him. She said, "Maybe not, but it'll hold." That was all. She walked on, and I stood there with my son asleep on my shoulder, and the heat coming up off the ground in slow waves, and I thought, I don't know that woman at all. I thought about her for 6 days after that. Let me back up. You need to understand what those 2 years had been before I can tell you what happened next, because otherwise none of it means anything. My wife's name was Ruth. She died 11 days after Caleb was born, and I'm not going to spend much time on that because there's nothing useful I can give you about it, except that the world changes its shape when something like that happens. Not the physical world. The ranch looked exactly the same. The mountains north of it looked the same. The creek ran the same, but the shape of things inside your own skull changes, and it takes a while to stop bumping into the corners of what used to be there. I had helped those first weeks. My neighbor Garrett came over with his wife, and they cooked and washed and kept the boy from harm while I got myself back to something functional. His wife showed me how to mix the formula, how to get the boy to take it when he didn't want to, how to read the different cries. I learned. I'm not a slow learner when something matters enough. By the time Caleb was 6 weeks old, I was doing it alone, and by the time he was 3 months old, I'd worked out a system. He slept in a box near my bunk, and I woke when he woke, and we managed. That's the word for it, managed. I don't tell you this for sympathy. I tell you because I need you to understand what I was before the fair, a man who'd locked a door inside himself and kept it locked not out of grief exactly, but out of the plain understanding that there wasn't room. I had a ranch to run and a boy to raise and no excess in me for anything else. I wasn't unhappy. I was just narrow. You get narrow when you have to. Ruth had been gone 2 years. Caleb had been talking in fragments for about 6 months and running since he was 14 months old and had opinions about everything. Which cup, which boot, which direction we'd walk to the barn, which side of me he'd sleep on. He was more his own person than I'd expected a 2-year-old to be. I liked that. I liked knowing him. But I'll tell you the thing I never said to Garrett or anyone else. At night, after Caleb went down, I'd sit on the porch and there was nothing wrong and I still felt it, a kind of lack I couldn't name. Not loneliness exactly, not grief exactly. More like standing in a house with one room still dark. You can live in the lit rooms fine, but you know that room's there. 6 days after the fair, I drove into town for feed. Clara Denning was coming out of the dry goods store with a sack of flour when I pulled up. We looked at each other. She said, "Did he run off again?" I said, "He's asleep in the wagon." She looked in the wagon bed and there was Caleb in the corner with his hat over his face, which was how he slept in the heat. She looked back at me and said, "You've got that figured out." I said I'd had to. We stood there a moment. The street had its usual midday noise, a horse being shod 2 doors down, someone arguing about money inside the store. I said, "Are you going back out to your homestead today?" She said she was. I said, "What do you grow out there?" She blinked, like it wasn't the question she'd expected. She said, "Corn, some squash, a few chickens. I had a mule but he died in March." I said, "What do you use for transport?" She said, "Mostly my own 2 feet. She said it without complaint, without asking for anything. Just the plain fact of how things were. I don't know what that did to me exactly. Something moved behind my ribs, some old instinct that recognized a problem it could do something about. I said, "I've got a wagon and a day with no pressing need. I could drive you back." She said, "I don't need that." I said, "I know you don't." She looked at me a long time. Then she said, "I've got a second sack inside." 8 miles is a fair distance in a wagon, long enough to find out a person's shape if you're paying attention. She'd been on that homestead 3 years. Her husband Elias had died of a fever the second winter, the same winter, she said, that everyone lost something. I knew the winter she meant. She'd stayed because the land was hers and she'd broken it herself alongside him, and she wasn't about to leave it to the first man who thought a widow alone was easy pickings. She said that the same way she said everything else, like she was reporting conditions. No drama to it. Just, here is what happened. Here is where I stand. Caleb woke up about 4 miles out and immediately wanted to sit in her lap. He didn't ask me. He just climbed over from my side, put his hands on her knee, and waited. She looked at him. Then she lifted him up and set him where he wanted to be. He rode the rest of the way sitting against her with his feet sticking out over the edge of the seat, pointing at every bird and every distant cow and saying words that were almost real words but not quite. And she responded to each one seriously, like she was having an actual conversation, which made him try harder. I watched the road and the mountains, and I didn't say much. When we got to her place, it was plain that she'd been doing it all herself. The fence on the south side needed 2 posts replaced. The roof over the chicken coop had a patch that wouldn't last another heavy rain. There was a lean-to at the back of the house that was listing a few degrees more than it should have been. None of it was bad enough to fall, but all of it was at the edge of what one person could manage. I didn't say anything about it. I helped her down with the flour. She thanked me. I put Caleb back in the wagon and I left. I came back 3 days later with 2 fence posts and a box of nails. She came out of the house when she heard the wagon, and she stood there on the step and watched me unload the posts. I didn't make a speech about it. I just carried them to the south fence and looked at the 2 bad ones and got started. She brought me water after about 20 minutes. She stood and watched me work for a while without speaking. That was its own kind of conversation. When I was done, she said, "What do you want for that?" I said nothing. She said, "I don't take charity." I said, "It's not charity. I had the posts in the afternoon." She looked at the fence and then at me. She said, "Come inside and eat." I ate at her table with Caleb in my lap, working through a piece of bread with the seriousness of a man solving a complicated problem. The food was simple beans and cornbread and early squash, but she cooked well, the way a person cooks when they've had to make plain ingredients work. We talked about the land out here, about water rights, about what the summer looked like for her corn, about a horse I was trying to get broke. Easy talk, nothing pressed. When I got up to go, Caleb reached for her. She took his hand and held it a moment, then let go and said, "You come back to the fair next year, you hear?" He said, "Yes," and then said the word he'd been saying since the fair, the word I'd been hearing in my head for 10 days. She looked at me, just a look. No embarrassment in it, no flinching. She just held my gaze and then looked back at him and said something quiet that I didn't catch. I drove home with the mountains going pink, and the boy asking questions I couldn't fully answer, and that door somewhere back in my chest. The one to the dark room, sitting, just slightly less shut than it had been. The roof on the chicken coop went 2 weeks later in a hard afternoon storm. I heard about it from Garrett, who'd heard from the man who ran the feed store, who'd heard from a rider who'd passed her place and seen the damage. I went the next morning. She was already up on the coop when I arrived, wearing a man's work shirt with the sleeves rolled and trying to nail a sheet of tin into place by herself, which wasn't working because you need 2 sets of hands for that, and she only had the one. The ladder wasn't quite right for the angle, and the tin kept shifting. I tied the horse and walked over, and she looked down at me from up there, and I could see she was deciding something. She said, "I've almost got it." I said, "You've almost had it for 20 minutes. She looked at me. Then she handed me an end of the tin, and I held it while she nailed it, and then I got up on the ladder myself and did the far side, and we got it done in about 12 minutes. She came down off the other side, and we stood there and looked at the roof. She said, "There's coffee inside." That was the first morning I sat at her table without having to fix something first. We drank coffee, and she fed Caleb a biscuit, and he sat on her floor and played with 2 rocks he'd found outside, banging them together with great satisfaction, and she watched him and I watched her watch him. She said, "He doesn't seem like he's missing anything." I said, "He's got what he needs." She said, "So do I." I understood her meaning. She wasn't asking for anything. She was telling me what was true, that she was whole, that she wasn't waiting to be rescued, that Whatever was or wasn't between us had to be understood on those terms. She had her land and her self-respect and her two hands, and she'd already survived more than most. I said, I know. She said, I'm telling you because I want you to know I see what you're doing coming out here, and I'm not asking you to stop. That was a lot from her. I sat with it. I said, I'm going to need to replace that linta before winter. She said, yes, you are. I kept coming. That's the simple truth of the next 2 months. I kept finding reasons, and then I stopped needing reasons and I just came. I fixed the lean-to, which took 3 days and needed a whole new frame. I helped her get the harvest in when it came time, working beside her from first light to the last of the evening. She worked the same as a man, steady and without ceremony, just put her head down and did what needed doing until it was done. Caleb followed her around the field like a small shadow, picking up squash with both hands and carrying it to the basket with a concentration that got me in the throat every time I watched it. Garrett came by my place one evening and said, with no preamble, "Are you courting Clara Denning?" I said I was helping her with her land. He said, "Tom, I've known you 15 years. I said I didn't know what I was doing. He said, "Yes, you do." I thought about that riding home. He wasn't wrong. I did know. I'd known for a while. I just hadn't said it to myself plainly because saying it plainly meant letting the door open all the way, and I'd been keeping that door at a crack for 2 months, letting in just enough air, not enough to commit to the weather on the other side. But here's the thing. Caleb knew. He'd known since the fair. He walked up to Clara Denning on a fairground with 1,000 strangers and he put his arms up. He knew. I'm not saying a 2-year-old made my decisions for me. I'm saying sometimes a 2-year-old sees what you're not letting yourself see and acts on it, and then you have to either lie to yourself or admit you've been lying to yourself. I stopped lying to myself around the middle of October. She had a good crop year. Not great, not the kind of year that changes your circumstances, but solid, enough corn to sell and a bit left for the winter stores. The day she came back from the grain buyer with her money in her pocket, she looked like a woman who'd settled a debt she'd been carrying a long time. Not relief exactly. More like, there. That's done, now we go forward. I was at her place when she came back. I'd been there most of the afternoon, doing some work on the chimney that had been venting wrong. Caleb was asleep on her floor on a blanket she kept there for him now, just appeared one day, folded near the hearth, without either of us making a remark about it. She came in and put her money away in the tin she kept on the high shelf, and then she looked at Caleb asleep and then at me. She said, "I want to tell you something and I need you to just listen first." I said, "All right." She sat down at the table across from me. She was still in her road dust. She put her hands flat on the table, palms down, and she looked at me straight. She said, "I know I'm not what a man thinks of when he thinks of starting over. I'm not young and I'm not easy and I've got land that needs work and I've got opinions about the work, and I'm not going to be someone who stops having opinions about it because she's got a man around. I want that said plainly." I said, "I know that." She said, "I also know you didn't come out here because you needed fence posts put in." I said, "No." She said, "What I want to know is whether you're here because you need someone or because you want me specifically. Because there's a difference and the difference matters to me." The room was quiet. Caleb made a small sound in his sleep and rolled and then went still again. I thought about Ruth and I thought about the fair and I thought about the morning she was up on that coop with the tin shifting in her hands, and I thought about all the mornings at her table, the way she talked about her land like it was kin to her, the way she was with Caleb, not soft and fussy about it, just present, just there, which was exactly what he needed and which was harder than fussy. I said, "You." She waited. I said, "I came out here 3 days after the fair with fence posts because you needed fence posts, and I had them and it was a reason. But I kept coming back because of you. Because you don't pretend anything is different from what it is, and you don't want anything from me that I haven't earned. Because you picked up my son on a fairground like it was the most natural thing in the world and then put him down again without making it into something. Because I watch you work and I think, that's a person I respect. And I hadn't thought that about anybody in 2 years. She looked at me for a long time. Outside, the evening had gone all copper and shadow. Inside, the fire was low, just enough for the room to be warm. She said, "Your boy already decided. I figured I'd let you catch up." I got up from the table and I went around it and I put my hand along her jaw and she turned her face into it, her eyes closing a moment. Just that one moment of letting herself be held before she came back to herself and looked up at me steady, square, not asking for anything except this. And I understood then exactly what I was to her. Not a rescue, not a convenience, not a way to survive the winter. Something she'd chosen, knowing what she was choosing. I leaned down and put my forehead to hers and stood there with the fire behind us and my son asleep on her floor and the mountains outside going dark, and I felt the whole shape of what we were building settle into its foundation like timber into stone. Solid, real, nothing borrowed or pretend about it. We married in November. Just Garrett and his wife as witnesses, and the preacher, and Caleb who stood beside Clara throughout the whole short ceremony holding onto her skirt and looking at the preacher with complete suspicion like he was trying to figure out what this man's angle was. Made Garrett's wife laugh hard enough she had to put a hand over her mouth. After Garrett shook my hand and said, "I told you so." I said, "You told me I knew what I was doing." He said, "And you did." Clara's land came with us into the marriage the way land does when a woman has a right to it. It was hers. She'd broken it, and nobody was taking that from her. We worked both properties, mine and hers, depending on what needed doing and the time of year. She made decisions about her corn and her chickens and her squash, and I made decisions about my cattle and my horses, and we worked together on the things that needed two people, which turned out to be more things than either of us had been doing alone. It was not a soft life. I want to be plain about that. That winter was hard, cold came early, and the fence on the east side of my ranch went down in a January storm, and we spent 2 days in near-freezing temperatures getting it back up. Clara was right there beside me, and she didn't romanticize it. She just worked. That was the truth of her, all of it. She didn't romanticize anything. She just worked. But there were evenings. Caleb would be down, finally, after a long argument about it, and the house would be quiet, and the fire would be down to coals, and Clara would be sitting with her mending, and I'd be reading the paper from town, 3 days old by the time we got it, and there was nothing happening except that, nothing significant, nothing you could point to and say, "There, that's the moment," just the two of us in the same room on a winter night, and the weight of what I'd carried for 2 years was just gone. Not remembered differently. Just gone. You live alone long enough, you stop noticing how much you're holding. The quiet seems like peace because you've got nothing to compare it to. Then something changes and you realize, that wasn't peace. That was just the sound of carrying. Caleb started calling her mama sometime around March. He'd been saying it in fragments since the fair, that word he put on her, but by March it had settled into use, the way words do with children, just a fact of how the world was organized. She didn't make a ceremony of it. She didn't get tearful. When he said it, she answered. That was all. I watched her answer him one morning. She was at the stove and he came in from outside with a frog he'd found near the water barrel and held it up and said, "Mama, look." And she looked and said, "Put it back before breakfast." And he looked at the frog and then at her and then went back outside. And she turned back to the stove and went on cooking. And I sat at my table and I thought, there it is. There's what I built. There's what I became, not through luck, not through someone feeling sorry for me, but because I showed up with fence posts and kept showing up, and because a woman who saw through everything saw me and decided I was worth her choice. I thought about the fair. That August heat, the trampled grass smell, the 100 pairs of boots, and my boy getting free of my hand and running to her, arms up. He knew. I just had to get there. Last summer, this would be 3 years after the fair now, we had a good harvest year, both properties, and Clara decided we should go back to the county fair to celebrate it right. She said Caleb should see the horses being shown, and the cooking contest, and the man who carved things out of wood who'd been there every year she could remember. I said, "You sure you want to go back to where this all started?" She looked at me like the question was barely worth her time. She said, "I know exactly where this started." So we went. Caleb is 5 now, which means he's faster than he was at 2, but at least I can talk to him. He walked between us the whole morning with his hand in Clara's hand and his other hand wrapped around 2 of my fingers, and he pulled us from the livestock to the horses to the wood carver and back again, and every few minutes he'd say, "Mama, look," and then turn around and say, "Papa, look," covering his bases, making sure neither of us missed anything important. We stood together near the cottonwood that had grown through the fence, the one where I'd been standing when she first walked past and said, "He's got your jaw," and Clara had her hand in the crook of my arm, and Caleb was about 20 feet away looking at a man spinning rope, and the whole day was around us. The heat and the trampled grass and the fried dough and the noise of it. And she leaned her head against my shoulder, just for a moment, and I put my hand over hers where it rested in my arm. She said, "He's going to run off again." I said, "Let him, he knows where to come back to." She was quiet, her hand warm under mine. She said, "So do you." And that was it, that was everything. The fair around us and the mountains in the distance, and my boy running free, and this woman at my side, who'd looked at me clear-eyed across a dusty fairground 3 years ago, and seen something worth staying for. I wasn't looking for it. I had both hands full and a door locked inside myself, and 2 years of narrow living behind me. But some things know where they're going before you do. My son lifted his arms to her on a fairground, and she picked him up, and that was the day, though I didn't know it yet. That was the day everything started moving toward what it was supposed to be. I'm not the kind of man who talks much about what he's grateful for. Ask Garrett, he'll tell you I can go a week without saying anything that isn't about the work or the weather. But I know what I have. I know what it cost both of us to get here, and what it is to have gotten here, and what she chose when she put her hands under my boy's arms and lifted him without being asked. She chose us, both of us, with her eyes open, knowing the full weight of it. And I have been every day since, exactly what that deserved.